I'm Eleanor, and I've been married to Henry for 35 years. We've carved out a quiet life together in a small town, him with his hands deep in wood and nails, building things that last, and me with my garden, coaxing life out of the soil. But lately, it feels like we're just shadows moving through the same old steps. The days blur, the nights fade, and somewhere along the way we lost the heat that used to keep us close. So we packed a bag, left the town behind, and drove up to a lakeside retreat in upstate New York, hoping a weekend away might shake loose whatever's been holding us still. The woods here are thick, dark pines stretching up to a sky that's all stars, and the lake glints under the moonlight like it's whispering something I can't quite hear. Our first night, we sat by the fire pit outside our cabin, the air sharp with autumn chill. I cradled a mug of cider, watching the flames dance, while Henry sat across from me, his broad hands resting on his knees. He broke the silence first, his voice low, carrying that weight I've known for decades. "You've been quiet lately, Eleanor, even in bed." There was no edge to it, just a tired truth. I poked at the embers with a stick, the spark snapping into the dark, and said, "Maybe there's nothing left to say or feel." The words landed heavy between us, and he didn't argue, just stared into the fire, the lines on his face deeper in the flickering light. That's when we heard it, laughter, bright and free, cutting through the night from the cabin next door. I turned my head, and there they were, Levi and Ruby, spilling out onto their porch with drinks in hand, their voices weaving together like they didn't have a care in the world. She was small, with a wild tangle of hair and a laugh that pulled you in. He was taller, easy in his movements, a grin flashing as he leaned against the railing. Ruby caught my eye across the distance, waved like we were old friends, and called out, "You two look lonely over there. Come join us." Henry shifted beside me, his boots scuffing the dirt, and I could feel him hesitate. But I stood up, brushing ash off my jeans, and looked down at him. "Let's go," I said, my voice firm. "We came here for something different, didn't we?" He didn't answer right away, but he pushed himself up, his shadow stretching long behind him as we crossed the grass. They welcomed us like it was nothing. Levi with a quick handshake and a grin that showed his teeth, Ruby with a glass of wine pressed into my hand before I could say no. We settled around their fire pit, the logs popping and the warmth seeping into my bones. Levi was 32, an electrician who talked with his hands, all energy and charm. Ruby was 30, an artist who painted murals, her laugh sharp and her eyes sharper. They had this ease between them, her hand resting on his arm, his shoulder brushing hers, and I felt it hit me, a pang I couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe, or envy for something we'd let slip away. Henry noticed, too, his gaze flicking between them as the conversation flowed, easy and light. Later, back in our own cabin, I stretched out on the bed, the quilt rough under my fingers, and watched Henry set his cider on the nightstand. "They've got something we don't," I said, my voice soft but pointed. He turned to me, his brow furrowing, the lamplight catching the gray in his hair. "What, youth?" he asked, half joking, half serious. I smiled, slow and knowing, and propped myself up on one elbow. "No, fun." His fingers twitched against the quilt, a small tell he couldn't hide, and I leaned closer, my breath brushing his ear. If we wanted, we could have that too. He didn't answer right away, just sat there, his chest rising and falling a little faster than before. I let the silence hang, heavy with possibility, and saw the flicker in his eyes, temptation, buried deep under years of steady routine. "You're serious," he said finally. Not a question, just a realization. I traced a finger along his wrist, feeling the pulse beneath his skin, and nodded. "Dead serious." He exhaled, a slow release, and I knew we were already stepping towards something neither of us could fully see. The next morning, the lake was still, a mirror of gray under a heavy sky. Henry was out by the water, skipping stones across the surface, his flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows. I watched him from the porch, my coffee cooling in my hands, when I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves. Levi appeared first, a fishing pole slung over his shoulder, followed by Ruby, her hair tied back with a scarf, a thermos dangling from her fingers. "Morning," she called, her voice bright against the quiet. "Thought we'd see if you two wanted company." Henry turned, brushing his hands on his jeans, and I stepped off the porch, meeting her halfway. "We'd like that," I said, glancing at Henry. He nodded, a small tilt of his head, and I caught the way his eyes lingered on them, curious, maybe even eager. We spent the day together, the four of us wandering the shoreline, trading stories over the splash of the water. Levi talked about rewiring old houses, his hands moving like he was still twisting wires, while Ruby showed me a sketchbook full of bold, swirling lines, murals she'd painted in places I'd never see. Henry loosened up, tossing in a dry joke about his carpentry days that made Levi laugh loud and hard. By afternoon, they invited us to their cabin for drinks that night. "Nothing fancy," Ruby said, her grin teasing. "Just good company." Henry agreed before I could, his voice steady. "We'll be there." I felt a spark then, not big, but real, flickering somewhere deep inside me. When evening came, we walked the short path to their cabin, the air thick with pine and the faint bite of wood smoke. Lanterns glowed through the windows, casting a warm haze over the porch. Ruby greeted us at the door, barefoot in a loose sweater, and handed me a glass of red wine. Her fingers brushed mine as I took it, a quick, warm graze that lingered on my skin. "Glad you came back," she said, her eyes catching mine with a glint of something playful. I smiled, sipping the wine, and followed her inside. Henry settled beside Levi at a small table, their talk of tools and lake fish filling the space, but I felt Ruby's attention on me, sharp and steady. She slid into a chair beside me, her knee brushing mine under the table as she poured herself a glass. "You two seem comfortable," she said, her tone light but edged with a question. I laughed softly, swirling my wine. "Too comfortable, maybe. That's why we're here." She tilted her head, considering me, her lips curling at the corners. "Looking for a shake-up?" Across from us, Levi's hand landed on Henry's shoulder, casual but firm, and I saw Henry's posture shift. Just a fraction, but enough to notice. I leaned closer to Ruby, my voice low. "Think they'd notice if we stirred things up?" She grinned, setting her glass down with a soft clink. "Let's find out." The night deepened, the lanterns flickering as the conversation slowed. Levi suggested we move inside, and we followed, the cabin's wooden walls closing us in with a rustic hush. Ruby sank onto the couch beside Henry, her bare foot brushing his leg. Not accidental, not subtle. He froze for a second, then exhaled through his nose, his hands resting on his knees. I settled next to Levi on the opposite side, his arm stretching along the backrest, his fingers grazing my shoulder as he leaned back. The air hummed, heavy with what we weren't saying, every glance and touch tightening the space between us. Ruby tilted her head at Henry, her voice soft but teasing. "You're quiet tonight." He met her eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just watching," he said, his tone rougher than usual. She smirked, leaning in just enough for her sweater to slip off one shoulder. "Good." I felt Levi shift beside me, his hand settling on my thigh, light but expectant. I didn't move, just let it rest there, the warmth sinking through my jeans. Ruby's fingers trailed along Henry's sleeve, a slow, deliberate path down to his wrist. "You don't have to just watch," she said, her breath close to his cheek. His jaw tensed, his hands flexing, caught between holding back and letting go. I dragged my nails lightly along Levi's hand, my voice lazy. "She's right." Henry's eyes flicked to me, a question in them, and I nodded. Just once, but enough. Ruby leaned in further, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered something I couldn't hear. His fingers twitched against his leg, and I saw it. The crack in his restraint, small but growing. Levi's grip on my thigh tightened, his breath warm against my neck, and he murmured, "Why don't you find out what happens next?" The room felt smaller then, the air thick with a pull I couldn't name, drawing us all towards something we'd started long before we walked through that door. Ruby's whisper hung in the air, her lips still close to Henry's ear. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, her fingers resting light on his wrist. "You don't have to just watch," she said again, softer this time, her voice a quiet dare. His hands flexed, caught in that space between restraint and surrender, then slid to her waist. Not pushing her away, just holding her there, his thumbs brushing the edge of her sweater. She smiled, slow and knowing, and leaned in. Her lips met his, deliberate, unhurried, a kiss that deepened as his breath hitched. I watched, my pulse thudding hard in my chest as his fingers tightened against her, his control fraying at the edges. Beside me, Levi's hand stayed firm on my thigh, his touch warm through the denim. He shifted closer, his breath grazing my neck, deep and steady. "Your turn," he murmured, his voice low, dark, vibrating against my skin. Before I could respond, he turned me toward him, his hand sliding around my waist, pulling me into the heat of his chest. My breath caught as his fingers traced the curve of my side, slow and lingering, drawing me closer. He didn't rush, just moved with intent, his presence wrapping around me like the woods outside. I curled my fingers against the couch, pressing into him as the air thickened, humming with something unspoken. His lips brushed my jaw, then my throat, a steady pull that sent a shiver cresting through me. Across from us, Ruby's hand skimmed Henry's chest, her touch teasing, unhurried. She eased herself closer, her knees brushing his as she settled against him. His head tipped back against the couch, a rough exhale slipping from his lips, his muscles shifting under her fingers. "Relax," she murmured, her voice thick with amusement, and leaned in again, her lips trailing a slow path down his neck. His hands flexed against the cushions, knuckles whitening, his restraint hanging by a thread. She smirked, her fingers circling lazily over his shirt, guiding him deeper into her rhythm. His breathing grew ragged, a sharp inhale breaking the quiet as she held him there, savoring every shift in his body. Levi's grip tightened on my waist, his touch grounding me as he moved closer still. His breath was warm against my ear, his fingers slipping just under the hem of my sweater, brushing my skin. "You're tense too," he said, his tone soft but edged with intent. I tilted my head toward him, feeling the heat of him sink into me, and hummed low in my throat. "Maybe I am." He didn't wait. His hold firmed, guiding me exactly where he wanted, and I let him. His hands traced higher, slow and sure, pulling me into his pace. My body pressed against his, the sensation coiling deep in my chest, tethering me to the moment. Each second stretched, the warmth building in waves, electric and undeniable. The cabin pulsed with it. The crackle of the fire outside, the rustle of fabric, the uneven breaths weaving together. Ruby let out a quiet, pleased sound, her movements deliberate, her control absolute. Henry's grip shifted from the couch to her hips, his fingers digging in as his body trembled beneath her touch. His expression tightened, his restraint crumbling as she guided him further, her hands skimming lower, lingering. He exhaled sharply, his voice rough with urgency. "You're trouble," he managed, and she laughed softly, her lips brushing his jaw. "You like it," she teased, keeping him exactly where she wanted. Behind me, Levi's breath turned ragged, his fingers tightening as he pressed himself closer. The space between us vanished, heat winding through me in a rhythm I couldn't resist. His touch was steady, threading urgency into every move, and I felt my own pulse quicken, the moment closing in around us. My hands gripped the couch harder, my body arching slightly as the sensation crested, sharp and alive. Across from us, Henry's head tilted back, a low, unsteady sound slipping from his lips as Ruby pushed him to the edge. His fingers twitched, caught between holding on and letting go, his body locking under the weight of it all. Then it hit, a tipping point, sudden and shared. The pull deepened, pressing in from all sides. Levi's breath faltered, a tremor running through him as he held me tight, caught in the fire threading between us. Henry's hands clenched, his body surrendering to the tension stretched taut across the room. The air pulsed, charged, a quiet release rippling through us. Not loud, not dramatic, just real, like a knot untying itself after years of strain. I gasped softly, the warmth settling low in me, while Henry's chest heaved, his eyes half closed, lost in whatever Ruby had pulled out of him. Levi eased back, his hand still on my arm, steady and warm, while Ruby leaned against Henry, her smirk softening into something satisfied. The silence came fast, heavy with what had just unraveled. The fire popped outside, the lake lapping at the shore in the distance, and we sat there, 4 figures breathless in the dim light. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his breathing still uneven, and glanced at me. I met his eyes, my chest tight, my skin still humming. There was no guilt there, no regret, just something new, raw, like he'd found a piece of himself he'd forgotten. I felt it too, a spark I hadn't known I'd missed, flickering bright and unsteady. Ruby stretched lazily, her foot brushing Henry's leg again, and Levi's fingers lingered on my shoulder, a quiet anchor. The night settled around us, thick and still, and I wondered what we'd do with this now that we'd let it loose. The cabin fell quiet, the crackle of the fire outside fading into a soft hum as the lake's gentle waves rolled against the shore. Ruby eased back from Henry, her smirk softening into a satisfied curve, her fingers brushing his arm one last time before she stretched out on the couch. Levi's hand lingered on my shoulder, warm and steady, his breath slowing as he leaned back beside me. Henry ran a hand through his hair, the gray strands catching the lantern light, and let out a long, uneven exhale. His eyes found mine across the dim room, not sharp with guilt or clouded with regret, but clear, alive, like he'd stumbled onto something he'd lost years ago. My chest tightened, my skin still tingling with the echo of what had happened, and I held his gaze, feeling the weight of it settle between us. No one spoke for a while. The air was thick, heavy with the aftermath, but not uncomfortable, just full, like the woods holding their breath around us. Ruby broke the silence first, her voice lazy as she reached for her wineglass. "Well, that was fun," she said, taking a sip, her eyes flicking between us with a glint of amusement. Levi chuckled low, his fingers tapping once against my arm before he let go. "Better than fishing," he said, and I couldn't help the small laugh that slipped out, sharp and sudden in the stillness. Henry shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and rubbed his hands over his knees like he was grounding himself. "You two are something else," he muttered, but there was no bite in it, just a quiet awe. We stayed another hour, the tension easing into something softer, warmer. Levi poured more wine, Ruby tossed a blanket over her legs, and we talked about nothing big, just the lake, the stars, the way the woods smelled after rain. But every now and then I'd catch Henry's eye, or feel Levi's knee brush mine, and the memory of those moments would flare up again, sharp and real. When we finally stood to leave, Ruby hugged me at the door, her arms quick but firm, and whispered, "Come back any time." Levi clapped Henry on the shoulder, his grin easy. "You're not half bad for an old carpenter," he said, and Henry laughed, a full, deep sound I hadn't heard in years. The walk back to our cabin was silent, the crunch of leaves under our boots the only noise. The night air was cool against my face, cutting through the warmth still coiled in me. Inside, we didn't bother with the lights, just kicked off our shoes and sank onto the bed, the quilt bunching under us. Henry reached for my hand, his fingers rough and familiar, and squeezed once. "Was that fun?" he asked, his voice quiet, rough around the edges. I turned to him, the shadows of the pines shifting across the ceiling, and let the question hang there for a moment. "It was something," I said finally, my thumb brushing over his knuckles. He nodded, slow and thoughtful, like he understood exactly what I meant. We lay there, side by side, the lake murmuring outside the window. I could still feel Levi's touch on my skin, the way Ruby had pulled Henry out of himself. And it wasn't just the thrill of it. It was the life in it, the pulse I'd forgotten I could feel. "You think they do that a lot?" Henry asked, breaking the quiet. I smiled into the dark. "Probably. They've got the energy for it." He huffed a laugh, his hand tightening around mine. "And us?" I turned my head, meeting his eyes in the dimness. "We've got something too. Maybe not like them, but it's there." He didn't answer, just held my gaze, and I saw it, a spark, faint but steady, flickering back to life after years of dust. I don't know what happens next, whether we chase that spark again with Levi and Ruby or on our own, or let it settle into something quieter, something ours. It felt good, though, to know it was still in us, buried under the routines and the years, waiting to be stirred up. The cabin creaked around us, the night stretching long and still, and I wondered if Henry was thinking the same thing, if he felt that shift too, that chance to be more than shadows again. What would you do if you had the chance to feel that alive, even just for a night? Tell me, I want to know.